Loud. Okay. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Hello. Hi. Today we are going to be doing something new, something exciting, and something that hopefully you find as interesting as I do. I have been thinking about this topic for weeks now, and I'm so excited to get it out of my head. This is going to be the start of a new series on this channel in which VoiceOver Z, hi, yes, hello, that is me, will be breaking down how they created the makeup for a specific film/TV series, while I, Painter Z, will be creating a look based on whatever we're talking about. Just a warning, some of these facts may be a little bit darker and creepier than you were expecting, and you might never watch these films the same way again. I know I didn't. Today our film is going to be The Wizard of Oz. You know it, you love it, you've surely heard many rumors, but have you heard everything? Let's find out. Take it away, VoiceOver Z. Why, thank you, Painter Z. So the first character we are going to be talking about, while Painter Z does her thing, is the Tin Man. And I would like to start out by addressing one of the biggest rumors that surrounds him. Rumor has it that the original actor who was cast, Buddy Ebsen of the Beverly Hillbillies and Barnaby Jones, died as a result of this movie, but that is in fact false. He actually lived a rather long life and unfortunately passed away due to respiratory failure on the 6th of July 2003. So that is many years after the movie came out. So Buddy Ebsen was actually originally cast as the Scarecrow, and the actor who plays the Scarecrow in the movie, Ray Bolger, was originally cast as the Tin Man. Weird, right? They basically pulled a huge no you on each other, because Ray honestly felt better as the Scarecrow. The studio MGM originally had no idea how they were going to costume Ebsen for his role. Which, fair enough, I mean, it was the 1930s and they needed to turn a whole man into a tin man. I cannot even imagine the confusion that was happening in the room at that time. So his costume was apparently originally comprised of stovepipe, which of course was quite heavy and rather sharp as well. It actually prevented the actor from moving fully, especially because he had like dance moves and stuff to do. And the metal started to pierce his body. They decided to make a few changes to the costume, and the changes ranged from the sharp metal to paper, and then a combination of cardboard covered in silver material, which is what they decided on. Now here's where things get really crazy and incredibly dark. The decision that they made regarding the makeup was that they would cover Ebsen in grease-based white clown paint and then apply aluminum dust over it. Yeah, you heard that right. They took aluminum dust and dusted it over this man's. I'm just gonna let that sit for a second. So when The Wizard of Oz began principal photography on the 12th of October 1938, Ebsen had actually finished all of his costume and makeup tests, recorded his songs for the film soundtrack, and completed 4 weeks of rehearsal. But 9 days later, he would be rushed into the hospital and placed in an oxygen tent because his lungs were failing. Ebsen described his horrific experience in his autobiography. Quote, "It was several days later when my cramps began. My first symptoms had been a noticeable shortness of breath. I would breathe and exhale and then get the panicky feeling I hadn't breathed at all. Then I would gasp for another quick breath with the same result. My fingers began to cramp, and then my toes. For a time, I could control this unusual cramping by forcibly straightening out my fingers and toes. One night in bed, I woke up screaming. My arms were cramping from my fingers upward and curling simultaneously so that I could not use one arm to uncurl the other. My wife tried to pull my arm straight with some success, just as my toes began to curl. Then my feet and legs bent backward at the knees. I panicked. What was happening to me? Next came the worst. The cramps in my arms advanced into my chest to the muscles that controlled my breathing. If this continued, I wouldn't even be able to take a breath. I was sure I was dying. It was said that the dust that he had been inhaling had either caused an allergic reaction or an infection. When he got to the hospital, he was barely breathing and his skin was starting to turn blue. They had to place him inside of an iron lung because he couldn't get enough oxygen to his blood, and his blood fermented. I'm gonna say that again. His blood fermented. The doctor described this as a breakdown of his nervous system. He had taken as much as he could in his body and it just broke down. So while recovering, MGM was not happy that Epson was missing filming. They made repeated calls to the hospital demanding that he come back to work. Epson stated, "It seemed they, MGM, couldn't understand that an actor could get sick. They were furious. Mervyn Leroy kept calling the hospital, saying he can't be in bed, he's due on the set. And Jack Dawn, the makeup artist, called me to tell me I couldn't possibly be sick because he had used, quote, pure aluminum dust on my face." So, of course, because the studio wants the film to continue on, and they couldn't do that while Epson was recovering from his illness, producer Mervyn Leroy hired Jack Haley to replace Epson. And because Epson had fallen ill away from the set, also just before production was shut down for several days, when the original director, Richard Thorpe, was fired, the rest of the cast were actually unaware of what had happened to Epson. Haley and others assumed he had been fired along with Thorpe, and although Epson was replaced before filming resumed, his voice can still be heard in the soundtrack when the quartet of Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion sings "We're Off to See the Wizard." Now, you might be wondering, did Epson sue after all of this? And the answer is no. Epson told Eugene Harmetz, the author of The Making of the Wizard of Oz, published in 1977, that litigation would have been a bad career move. You didn't just lightly sue MGM because it was a power. There was a certain cohesion between the moguls. They all used to play poker together on Saturday nights and decide who were the good actors and who were the bad. In an interview years later, Epson recalled, "There was in those days particular pressure, and still is, but they just didn't believe that actors got sick, legitimately were casualties. I think they suspected that I was unhappy because originally I had been promised the part of the Scarecrow, and they switched me to the Tin Man, and they thought I bore a grudge and now I'd get even with them. They thought I was malingering, and so Mervyn called the hospital, and I can still remember the nurse in the conversation with him. I was under an oxygen tent at the time. Why isn't Mr. Epson on set? And she said, "Listen you, Mr. Epson is a very sick man, and we're going to keep him here until he's well." And so they did, and they got somebody else to play the part, but they never quite believed that I was really sick. And so, the Tin Man was now going to be played by Jack Haley. The Tin Man costume was heavy, it was hot, and it was very uncomfortable. Haley had a board that was specifically made for actresses with huge gowns and corsets that he could use to lean against just to get some kind of relief between the shots. Luckily, they did change the way they did the makeup, turning it into a paste so that he wouldn't be inhaling the dust. They applied white grease-based clown makeup to his skin, and then they painted the aluminum paste over him to give him that metallic sheen. Now, unfortunately, Jack Haley did not come away from this unscathed. Some of the paste got into his right eye, and it caused a really bad infection that required surgery and lying in a dark room to recover. He missed 4 days of filming while recovering from this, but luckily suffered no permanent damage and did not lose his job. Okay, so now let's move on to the Scarecrow. While this was all happening to the Tin Man, poor Scarecrow was not having a good time either. Unfortunately, it was the 1930s and they didn't have a Barry Gower or a Tom Savini to create the special effects. They had to work with what they had, and what they had was... Whew. Now, don't get me wrong, the makeup still looks pretty good. I mean, after a rewatch of the movie, I was really impressed with how well it held up and how good it looked. However, it's a lot to take in. The prosthetics that were placed on the actors regularly weren't taken off gently using any of the products designed for removal, and instead they were pulled off each and every time. The Scarecrow used a total of 40 masks that had to be yanked off his skin. Bolger recalled, quote, "I came home exhausted and had 2 bourbon old fashions. The drinks were therapeutic. I needed the alcohol to let me down, and they had just enough sugar to kind of give me a lift so I could manage to eat my dinner and fall into bed." End quote. These actors often spend up to 13 hours per day in these costumes. They would try and eat and drink in the makeup, but if they couldn't, they would have to go through the whole shoot day without food because they weren't willing to take off and redo the makeup. Ray Bolger and Jack Haley said, quote, "The prosthetics weren't porous, so you couldn't sweat and you couldn't breathe through your skin. You don't realize how much you breathe through your skin until you can't do it. We felt like we were suffocating." End quote. Ray Bolger also discovered after the last take of the film that the corners of his mouth and his chin were permanently lined from his makeup. He stated that it took months for them to fade away. It was as though he had like a Joker smile. And Jack Haley had said that his costume and his prosthetics were, quote, "no less awful. They pulled my hair back as flat as they could and put some sort of rubber skin over my head and glued it down behind my ears. They covered my face with cold cream. Then they took white chalk-like salt and painted my face white. The idea of the white stuff was to close my pores so that the silver paste that made me look like I was made out of tin wouldn't damage my skin. They painted my face silver and glued on a silver nose. They glued a strip of rubber that was supposed to be tin under my chin and glued each individual rubber rivet onto my face. Then they painted my lips black because painting my face silver made my mouth look too red, coloring my lips. Black made my gums and tongue duller. I couldn't breathe through my face. None of us could." And poor Bert Layer had the worst of it all. Bert played the Cowardly Lion, and his costume was made out of real lion hide. Yeah. Actual, real life lion skin sewed together to make a costume. When I tell you, rewatching this movie made me so uncomfortable every time he was on screen. It was almost 90 pounds or 40 kilograms heavy. Sure, this must have been quite a difficult costume to imagine because they didn't have the luxury of CGI or any of the great technology we have now, but whew. Listen, the concept made a lot of sense on paper, but it ultimately pushed the actor to his limits. Since every lion has a unique fur pattern and those calling the shots wanted to keep each scene consistent with the last, they had to find a way to make every shot visually seamless. And their solution was keeping Bert in the same suit throughout the bulk of the production, supplying only a single backup, also made from lion skin, that proved equally troublesome. Not to mention that both turned out to be rather expensive, so the studio didn't really budge on supplying any more than they had to. The suit was incredibly hard to maneuver and dance in, and after spending all that time under the huge hot studio lights, poor Bert began to sweat buckets in the suit, and it caused damp and a horrendous smell that this man's had to deal with. Putting the suit together was a production in and of itself, since the mask alone took hours to apply and confined Bert's face so much that he had to eat and drink through a straw. Chewing would break the prosthetic, and sometimes Bert would get real angry at Jack and Ray for being able to eat between shots, and sometimes the hanger would get far too much and he would just grab a sandwich and break through his makeup, like just bust through it. Okay, so now we've done majority of the good guys, right? Let's move on to everyone's favorite villain, the Wicked Witch of the West. The Wicked Witch of the West was played by Margaret Hamilton. You've seen her, you love her, she's green, it's great. But what wasn't so great is that the green makeup that they used back then was made of copper oxide because the cosmetic industry hadn't actually figured out how to make green makeup yet. And as you can guess, copper oxide is pretty toxic. The makeup department had to be super thorough when removing her makeup at the end of each day because if any of it was left behind, it could poison her. So fairly early on in the movie, the Wicked Witch of the West arrives in Munchkinland, gives her little speech, you know the one, "I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too." Okay, and then she leaves in a puff of smoke and fire. However, unfortunately when filming this scene, there was quite a disastrous accident. On December 23rd, 1938, Margaret was meant to stand on a false piece of the yellow brick road, which was connected to an elevator, which would bring her down and out of the shot. While she was being lowered, smoke would billow up to conceal her, and once she was safely underneath, the fire would shoot up. Hamilton said, quote, "We were about 40 feet away from the fire, and Miss Burke shook her head and said, 'Oh, I'm not going to stand here.' And I said, 'Why not, Miss Burke?' And she said, 'Oh, my dear, it's much too hot.' And I thought, you're 40 feet away and I'm going to be right in the middle of it." End quote. They needed to practice this and get it just right because she had to back up onto the false door at exactly the right time. If she got on it too early, the shots would be awkward. Too late, and she stood the risk of breaking her legs. Also, the elevator shaft was really narrow too, so she really had to tuck her elbows in close to her body. And guess what? The first time they did the shot, it was absolutely perfect. Chef's kiss. But Victor Fleming, the director, decided he wanted to do another shot just in case. And that's when things got awful. Nothing was going right. She wasn't hidden by the smoke. The fire came too late. Just everything was going wrong. Hamilton said, quote, "And then we got the full tilt of Mr. Fleming's impatience and anxiety. In no uncertain language, he told us to pull ourselves together and get the shot done. He said, 'There's no excuse for this. The minute she gets her foot on, I want it done.' And I said, 'Mr. Fleming, I want to get both feet on.' And he said, 'Yes, of course, but I want the shot done right and right now.' Unfortunately, the fire went way too early while Margaret Hamilton was not under the stage yet. So the broom that she was holding caught fire and it caught her face on fire. She said, quote, 'I felt warmth on my face, that's all. It's still unbelievable. There was a whole lot of running and hullabaloo and shouting, and my hat and my broom were on fire, and I didn't even know it.' She was in shock, of course. She ended up with first-degree burns on her face, mainly her chin, her cheek, and her forehead. Her eyebrows and lashes were completely burned off, and she had second and almost third-degree burns on her hands. The skin on her right hand was completely gone. It was just raw flesh. Now, everybody take a deep breath. Remember that makeup that I was telling you about? The toxic green makeup? Well, when the flesh on her hands literally peeled off from the burns, they still had to remove that makeup. And the only way that they could do that was with the use of alcohol. So they had to use alcohol to scrub off this toxic makeup from poor Margaret Hamilton's burned flesh. She said it was the most horrific pain she's ever felt in her life, and she was out for 6 weeks healing. "I'll never, as long as I live, have anything that takes my breath away like that pain," she said. And for the second half of the film, Margaret Hamilton's even wearing green gloves instead of the green makeup because her hands hadn't healed enough for her to apply the makeup. She also decided not to sue as she wanted to be able to work in the future. They had to pause filming, but once she came back, she put her foot down, as she should, and she said that she would no longer work with fire. But there was another scene, if you remember the Surrender Dorothy scene, where they wanted her to sit on a pipe that would blow smoke out of the back, but she refused. They even said to her that they would make her a fireproof suit, and she was just like, "Boy, what do I need a fireproof suit for if there's not going to be any fire?" So she refused. And wildly, that pipe actually exploded and severely wounded her stunt double, Betty Danko, and it left her with permanent scars on her legs. Now, this next bit has nothing to do with makeup, but I mean, let's just go full ham into the darkness of this movie at this point. Judy Garland, precious, sweet baby, was cast as Dorothy at the age of 17, and she did not have a good time. I'm just going to put a bit of a trigger warning here. This is going to get a bit intense. She was often sexually assaulted by some of the Munchkin actors on set. They made her life miserable, and they would constantly put their hands under her dress. The studio executives started monitoring what she was eating because they said that they needed her to look younger, as Dorothy was meant to be 12 in the book, but 15 in the movie. She was forced to stay on a pretty steady pill schedule where they would give her what they called pep pills to help her stay awake, and then they would give her downers to get her to sleep. So she would sleep for around 4 hours, they would shake her awake, give her the pep pills, and then force her to work. During filming, she was on the diets of soup, cigarettes, pills, and black coffee. They also made her wear really intense corsets and strapped her chest down so that it would make her look like she didn't have a chest. I can't even begin to imagine. It must have taken so much out of that young girl. And then to still go out and be peppy and cheery on the film, crazy and so sad. And the fact that the rest of her life was pretty much ruined by this abuse, it's just so incredibly sad. Now, to finish up, I'm going to give you a crazy fact, a sort of sad, wholesome tidbit, and then I'm going to break another rumor. So, in the scene where the poppies are making them fall asleep, right, the Wicked Witch of the West sends a field of poppies and it makes them fall asleep, and then Glinda pops up and she's like, don't worry guys, I got you, this is fine, and she sends down a bunch of snow to wake them up. Take a wild guess what they used for the snow. Because whatever you're thinking, I'm pretty sure it's not correct. Cotton wool? Nah. Asbestos? Yeah, they were raining asbestos on these people. Hello? Watching the movie and seeing it falling all over them and getting in their mouths and stuff, it just gives me the chills. Now for the wholesome, kinda, of the three main male characters, Ray Bolger, Bert Lair, and Jack Leahy. Ray Bolger was actually the last to pass away, and when Jack Leahy died, Ray gave a eulogy at his funeral and said, Jack, it's going to be very lonesome on the yellow brick road now. And finally, there is a rumor that one of the Munchkins actually hung themselves in a tree and that you can see the body dangling in the movie, but it's false. It is 100% false. It was actually a large bird that opened up its wings and kind of looked like that. And then, of course, as the internet's got, better or whatever, people started editing it to make it look like a swinging body. It's false. Like, it was a bird. I'm pretty sure if there was a rando hanging man, like, somebody would have seen it, first of all, and second of all, they wouldn't have put that in the movie. They would have reshot it. Come on. But it is definitely one of the most enduring rumors. And now, if anybody says, did you know, you can laugh in their face. No, I'm just kidding. But maybe, just pop them this link. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But that is all the information that I have for you, and I am now going to pass you to the freshly painted Paintersy. Alrighty everybody, thank you so much for coming along on this wild, twisty, dark adventure with me. If you have any other movies you would like me to cover, please feel free to leave your suggestions down below. Until next time, stay cute, stay safe, and don't eat the asbestos snow. Bye! Loud. Okay.